Okay, let's go straight into the next session. We have to follow things at a rather quick pace. We have less than an hour. Yes. This session is focusing on what power will look like in 2040. And I think for those of us, and it was also mentioned on the previous panel, it really is a challenge. We are immersed in the present, and we are encouraged to comment 24/7 on events, Macmillan's famous events, but we also need to look at the big picture, the mega trends. So let me start with Constanza. You've written extensively about Germany's Zeitenwende, and on the transatlantic relationship. And we're seeing, huge changes. We've seen the EU using its budget for security and defense purposes. We've seen the Zeitenwende, we've seen a huge commitment now to opening the doors to Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and of course we have 6 other countries who are also in the queue, 6, 7. So I think the question really is this enough? I mean, even can the EU make this transformation on the continent, but also will this be enough looking at a 2040 scenario?
All right, well, first off, thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. I think these ESPAS foresight exercises, of which I've been a part in the past, are incredibly important, and never more than now. And I understand the presentist temptation or compulsion that Anna Luhrmann talked about, but if ever events, dear boy, were compelling in the sense of forcing us to think about our strategy, I would say it is what we are living through now. This will date me when I started my journalistic career. I started out as a journalist with the Rwandan and Balkans genocides, and spent some time both in the Balkans and in Central Africa, and then writing about war crimes tribunals. And that seemed like a terrible, archaic interruption of a global progress towards peace, prosperity, and democracy, and something that we thought of at the time as democratic entropy worldwide. And I think what we are witnessing now looks like something of the reverse. I am not a congenital pessimist. I do think we have options, but I think we have to understand just how severe the circumstances are that we find ourselves in order to rise to the occasion. And I think that covers, and I know we're supposed to be brisk, so I will just sort of briefly touch on what I think this means. Europe's borders, maritime and land borders, are indefensible. We know that. That doesn't mean we should forego defense and deterrence and resilience in terms of providing for our own hard power. But I think we all know that we have been able to enjoy the stability, prosperity, and security that we've had for 30 years because of the American nuclear umbrella. Should that, for whatever reason, including a reason that might arise out of the 2024 elections, be denied to us, we will be in very bad shape indeed. And Europe is in absolutely no position to replace that security umbrella in short order. That is not to say that we should forego the other aspects of power, of which we can much more readily avail ourselves. Economic and regulatory power, some in America call it lawfare, I think we might as well. And finally, soft power. And I will end with a point that I think is absolutely key. The core of our soft power is rooted, our legitimacy abroad and in the world, is rooted in our commitment to our own democracies. If we forego that, if we fail there, and you all know what I'm speaking about, then I think, frankly, military defense and deterrence is of little value. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constanza. That was very important. I'd like to turn to Miko Huatari and just ask you about, well, the Americans always say, you need to walk and chew gum. And I think Europeans find that quite difficult. So, the degree to which Europe can focus on its own hard power, which is a huge departure from the past. Does it make it capable of looking at what Americans are looking at, and that is the rise of China? The rise of China, but also the problems of China, because the picture is a little bit more nuanced than just the rise of China. Can you enlighten us on China's trajectory and European policy? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the fantastic question, also for the invitation. I think indeed that we've come a long way already in Europe in understanding challenges that arise from China's behavior, engagement, bilateral relations, but also its global footprint. And I think it's absolutely critical for us to dig deeper into where China is heading. It's probably one of the biggest questions that we've all have to face and understand. And currently we're in a phase of deep uncertainty. China is in a period of long economic COVID at this point. It's not going to recover easily from that. It's looking at an extremely turbulent and spiral dynamics of US-China relations, which leads to a hardening of positions in Beijing these days, despite the strategic stability that both sides are seeking at the moment. And if you look at the political development in China, it is one that is certainly characterized by an outlook that is more centralized, more oriented towards control, etc. So the direction of travel, I think, is quite clear, but lots of uncertainties that they're currently dealing with. Centralization of power, party-state control over the economy, and global assertiveness, I think, is a shorthand for where China is heading at the moment. Now, many observers are a bit confused these days because they get signals about China reopening, business is possible again. But I think we should not be too confused about the fundamentals of the trajectory at this point. And for doing that, I think we need to look at the outlook for Chinese capabilities and the strategic intent and thinking inside Beijing. They are looking at turbulent storms ahead. They say this very clearly and they mean it. They look at a dramatic power shift between the West and the East, which they are shaping. They're looking at a battle and attacks that they expect to come largely from the United States, but also from the West more broadly. So there's a sense of encirclement, paranoia in Beijing at this point, I think, that we have to take very seriously. You pointed to the fact that China's rise is something that we need to question, at least also in economic terms. And indeed, I think probably projections that many have made about China overtaking the United States, etc., have to be taken with a grain of salt. We're looking at a plateauing, maybe stagnating China at this point. Does this mean we can rest and basically say it's going to sort itself out? Absolutely not. Actually, I think precisely because of that, we're looking at a period where Europe will have its China shock in terms of industrial and manufacturing competitiveness that the United States had 10 or 15 years ago. And that has led to dramatic policy consequences in the United States, and we have not yet had that experience. So let's not rest. I think we have to take very seriously both the structural change in China's economy, but also the build-up of political and military and security capabilities as a manufacturing power, as a security power, as a climate and green tech leader. We are having debates about climate diplomacy. China is doing green tech leadership. That's, I think, the way how we have to look at these. And let's also not forget that China's state apparatus is looking at power largely from a regime security perspective, where the coercive capacity and information control sit at the center of what they're doing and projecting internationally increasingly. So, final sentence, we have to deal with a China that is prepared for a relative gains world. They don't care too much if there's no win-win internationally despite their rhetorics. It's about losing less in a period of globalization where everyone is looking pretty weak. So that's what they're preparing for, and I think that's a challenge for us.
Thank you. I'll come back to you on this question, but before I do that, I'd like to turn to Stephen. And we talked about multilateralism in the previous session, and of course that's the EU's comfort zone. but the world increasingly is not multilateralist. So how does one position Europe? But also, so in sort of, navigating between, a sort of idealist goal of reforming a multilateral system, but also navigating the geopolitics of it, but also the timing. I mean, we're talking about a scenario for 2040, but what actually needs to be done now in order to be still influential in 2040?
Thank you very much, Rosa, for that, and great to be with good friends on this important panel. I think the subtitle of today's event is strategic choices, making the right strategic, and you push me in that direction. So I have 4 very rapid strategic choices building on what we heard in the first panel. On first, and you mentioned this, Rosa, on our relationship with power. Indeed, we're entering this power political world. This is not the world that the European Union chose, but it's the world that we face. And we see increasingly big actors acting in a power political way, and we find this difficult to respond to. But in the Ukraine case, we did, in a very impressive way. Perhaps we're now seeing increasingly pushback these days, but I would still say it's a clear and excellent example of Europeans acting and thinking in terms of power, breaking taboos, mobilizing the many folds and leverages and levers of power that we have for a geostrategic goal. And the Ukraine exception, I believe, has to become sort of the norm going forward. It does not mean giving up on multilateralism, au contraire. It means realizing that if you want to uphold the rules-based order, you have to put power behind it. That's the first choice. It's a conceptual choice. The second choice is organizational. If for geostrategic reasons we are, as we should, accelerating the enlargement track, if we're going to build a union of 35, maybe more, we have to accept the consequences of this. What doesn't work at 27 in terms of decision making will not work at 35. So we really have to grapple this question of decision making and our collective capacity to take decisions that are strategically meaningful in time. And I think there's no way of escaping the majority voting issue, and neither is there a way of escaping the budgetary aspects that flow from that. The second organizational real challenge that we have to get right, important things we have to get right now to matter still in 2040, is enhance our capacity to deliver policy packages. This is a more transactional world, as Vice President Šefčovič also alluded to. We have to enable ourselves to develop these policy packages across policy fields. We can do trade-offs, but not across policy fields. And we have to get these mechanisms in place. Third one, I go quickly, is structural. How do we organize the European security order? This brings you to questions of EU-NATO going forward. And Constance rightly alluded to uncertainties around US commitment to NATO that may flow from presidential elections to come next year. Big questions for Europe, what that means. We can go into that perhaps in a second. There's also the question more widely, how is our relationship as EU with the United Kingdom, with Turkey? Will they be in by 2040? Will they be not? What is our relationship with these 2 vital geostrategic players? Finally, positional strategic choices. We can talk about how the European Union positions itself vis-a-vis US-China, but there's also this wider world. A lot of pivotal players expecting more from the European Union, which seems difficult for us to deliver. If you go to the Indo-Pacific, the wider Indo-Pacific, it's not just China. Asia is big and diverse, and Mikko knows this. There's a lot of expectations from us. People want more from the European Union, more than we are presently able to deliver. On Africa, we talked about, at the beginning of this mandate, sister continent. Have we fully delivered on those expectations? I'm not sure. Let me leave it there. There's more stuff to discuss.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'd like to ask you all to prepare yourselves for questions, because we will have time for questions. But before I do that, I'm going to just go back to our panelists, because I do have some follow-up questions, building on what you said and what also the other panelists said, so that you can also engage with each other. Constanza, you mentioned democracy at home, and as you know, I share very much your preoccupations, and of course with 2024, with the elections in the United States, that also, I mean, already in 2016 it put a very strong light on the situation of democracy in the United States. There is a problem in advanced democracies. But I think what I'd like to ask you is, how do we look at that and recognize that our asset is in our democracies that probably need to be upgraded, protected, paid more attention to, but then the international dimension, because then we are dealing with autocracies and authoritarian states that are much more nimble on the international scene, but we are held to account on the way in which we conduct our foreign policy. The credibility of the EU is not just based on what it does at home, it's also based on how it conducts its foreign policy. So how do we navigate this challenge in this contested world?
All right, well, thank you very much. As you say, it's a question that is worrying me intensely. And in terms of what could be happening in America, this is a movie that we've seen, and apparently it's preparing for a rerun. And I think the rerun could be a lot more nasty than the first version. I'll be writing about this. Other people are already writing about it. I'm sure you've seen reporting in the New York Times and Axios and the Washington Post. Much of what the hard right in America is thinking about is about changing the domestic order, but just what that change would mean, I think, is best encapsulated in the title of a book by Patrick Deneen, Regime Change. Make no mistake, what the hard right in America wants is a switch out of the American constitutional order, and its model is a certain EU member state. They talk about it a lot. And I think that is what we are looking at. But given the fact that the hard right is on the rise across Europe and that we have European elections next year and elections in 7 EU member states and in 3 East German member states where the AfD is currently trending at 34 to 37%, in some cases in informal private polls at an absolute majority, I think we have no excuse not to understand what we are looking at. And obviously, this would not just have consequences for our international orders in terms of making coalitions more difficult, but also in making the bandwidth for policymakers much more narrow. I think a lot of us have grown up with two, I think, perceptions about ourselves in the foreign policy space that are mistaken. I think many of us here, my age or younger, in the post-Cold War era, grew up thinking we would be consumers of prosperity, stability, and security, rather than creators or participants in that. And I think it is not unfair to say that in the foreign and security policy tribes, there was a certain sort of theocratic assumption that we made the rules and the hoi polloi, the electorate didn't have much of a say in it. I think those two things have changed. We have obligations as citizens that stare us in the face, and indeed there are things we can do as citizens that have nothing to do with our day jobs. I don't think I have to explain that. I think all of us can think of examples of things that we could do. But again, the hard right tends to be not very explicit about what it wants to do in foreign security policy, but I think we can extrapolate. We can extrapolate from their visions of internal order. We can extrapolate from their explicit admiration of authoritarians. We can most certainly extrapolate from the comments that the GOP presidential frontrunner is currently making when he refers to his opponents as vermin, whom he intends to pursue with the help of the Department of Justice, a Department of Justice that he says will be entirely subjugated to his vindictive search for revenge on his enemies. And so here we are. Let me just encapsulate this in one word, the word that I just used: enemies. The other thing that's changed in our perception of our strategic environment is, of course, we thought we were already making a huge sort of psychological, emotional, and political shift by moving from convergence theory to strategic competition, right? To the assumption that we are in a world where globalization and deepening interdependence means that there will be strategic competitions with rivals and adversaries who don't think like us, who don't want to be like us, and where just the closeness of our interactions will produce misunderstandings, frictions, etc., etc. I think the one thing that we have left out in that shift is the notion that abroad and at home there are elements, factions, powers who think of us as their enemies in absolute terms. And I think we need to understand that that is what we're dealing with and be able to respond to it without, and this is very important because we've been there once before, without reverting to thinking of them in the same ways. There's the one thing democracies must do, and it is this which President Biden meant when he said to the government of Israel, do not make the mistakes we made after 9/11. Thank you.
Thank you, Costanza. And indeed, I wonder how China views us on the basis of what you were telling us earlier. And I'd like to follow up on that. How should the EU position itself? I mean, you know, there is a US-China competition, even though I think US policy has become a little bit more nuanced over the past few months. But where should the EU position itself? And how to understand that, I mean, in Russia, it's become obvious that Russia sees us as enemies, but how does China see us?
I think I've pointed to some key ingredients of top Communist Party leadership world perceptions. They do see themselves in a deep structural strategic competition, as you pointed out, that has implications for the regime security and very strong security elements, has a component that I think Europeans tend to overlook, which is about hard military power. We are actually witnessing the emergence of a new arms race in many ways, but also a leadership that looks at competition with the West as part of a systemic competition. Now we're still doubtful whether that's the right term, how we should call China, etc. I mean, which is quite funny because the Chinese have decided for a long time that they are in such a systemic competition. So in that sense, this is a battle that they are to win, and Europe is a battleground for them. They say it explicitly in US-China competition, and I don't think we accept that perception yet. And if you ask about our own positioning, I think we've indeed, you know, over the past 5 years with strategy documents, the latest in this row probably being the German-China strategy, come to a more nuanced, realistic, less naive understanding of that challenge. But it feels to me, as a China observer, that we're probably heading into a new paradigm shift if it gets clearer by the day that, as I said earlier, China is out there to outcompete us with regard to its industrial base. And that aspect, I think, is fundamentally underestimated still, because that's the premise of our deep collaborative engagement that we've had for a long time. China is out there to outcompete us with regard to technological development, and any sort of innovation entanglement is fantastic for them as long as it benefits building up their own ecosystems. And China is out there to outcompete us with regard to their global footprint, where our own global gateway, which we all celebrate here, is fantastic, but it's a latecomer and it's extremely slow, and it is, you know, it's great that we all stick to it and, you know, talk it up, but the reality out there is that we're losing ground. So in many ways, I think we have to wake up to a situation where this paradigm of China being everything, maybe on Monday partner, on Tuesday competitor, on Wednesday a rival, that this time is over. There needs to be a sense of urgency with regard to protective measures. I think that's part of it. The trade defense instrument announcements and investigations that have just been launched are appropriate, but they're not enough. And then the economic security component of, I think, clearly points to a direction where hard trade-offs will need to be made. we cannot just continue business as usual with China, even if we wish it to be that way. And I think that goes for those countries that are most exposed first. Germany is certainly among them. But I think we have a long way to come after the initial recognition of that non-convergence that I think has now settled in.
And speaking of awakening, and Stephen, you mentioned, and you've worked a lot on Asia, you mentioned the wider Indo-Pacific. Europe always seems to be surprised when the rest of the world doesn't actually agree with it or doesn't, follow in its steps. Can I ask you to elaborate that point a little bit more before we take it to the audience and gather some questions and comments?
No, absolutely. I think Constance is absolutely right to remind this audience and ourselves about the very real possibility of darker scenarios in the United States emerging. Again, not what we wish for, but it's something that we have to take into serious account. And I think Europeans have to think very hard about the consequences, so have a less romantic, traditional view of the transatlantic alliance and allow ourselves the intellectual space and the political preparations for different scenarios. It gets you into resilience and agility and what have you. She's also right to say that this is not an exclusive US phenomenon. There are very serious challenges to democracy inside the EU. I think everybody knows that. Miko is absolutely right to remind ourselves about the growing role of the Chinese Communist Party and its ideology. There was, for many, many years, there was a pragmatic streak to Chinese policy making. And we see that that's increasingly under pressure. We see that collective leadership, which was a key feature of the Chinese system, is eroding, if not gone. So it is correct to expect a greater role of ideology in Chinese policy making, and therefore this triptych that we gave ourselves of partner, competitor, systemic rival, not strategic rival, systemic rival, is increasingly under strain as well. And it's not indeed Monday partner, Tuesday competitor, Wednesday. It's all these things at the same time, whilst knowing that the relative weight among the three is changing and that the competitor and the systemic rivalry is growing. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to have a more robust and realistic approach to China where these last two factors feature more prominently. You have to do the homework agenda, the defensive agenda of trade defense and everything that comes on anti-subsidies and the coercion instrument and 5G and investment screening and perhaps more on export control and what have you. You also have to do more on the offer side. So not only defense, but also on the offer side. And that brings me to the rest of Asia. Indeed, if you travel around the wider Indo-Pacific space, there is a clear demand for greater European engagement and more concrete cooperation under the global gateway, but also in the space of security. Where we have pronounced certain policy commitments as EU, but perhaps not fully fulfilled those. So I think that that's the task that we need to get right in the next mandate. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have 20 minutes for questions and comments from the audience, and I'm assuming we have a microphone circulating. And I already have Heather Graby from Bruegel, so please. So if, Heather, can you put your hand up so the microphone can come in? No, that way, behind you. Yeah. And if we have, yes, we have another question. So maybe we'll take 2 or 3 from the audience before coming back to the panelists.
Thanks. So just coming to a couple of what Stephen referred to as darker scenarios, given that we're thinking forward, a year from now, we could be contemplating the double whammy of a new US president or president-elect, who is announcing an even more harsh and hawkish approach to China, which could be, at that point, looking like it could lead towards some kind of military confrontation. And at the same time, that same president-elect announcing that he's going to do some kind of deal with Russia. The Ukraine conflict is going to be over because Ukraine won't be supported militarily anymore. What can we do to prepare for that, unfortunately, not very unlikely scenario? Should we be preparing the kind of economic moves that Miko was talking about vis-a-vis China, the kind of wider ally gathering that Stephen was talking about? should we be actually facing up to the need to develop a security strategy, both for support of Ukraine by Europe alone, or Europe with a few allies, not including the United States, and a security strategy for a US-China confrontation, which we don't want to be involved in, but where we have no choice but to take sides?
Thank you very much. Can you pass to there's another question from Bart. Bart, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself because I can't pronounce your surname. And then we'll go for Elena Lazaro. So we have 3 great questions.
Hi, Bart Schefter, the German Marshall Fund. Thanks very much for your very interesting remarks. My question is about Russia and Russian power and how you see it evolve over the next 10 to 15 years. At one point, it was viewed as a great power. Now it might be the second strongest military in Ukraine, whereas before it was viewed as the second strongest military in the world. How do you see the evolution of Russian power, and how do we make sure that Russia is not a threat to Ukraine or to its neighbors for the foreseeable future to come?
And can you pass it on to Elena, just next to you? Yep.
Thank you. Good morning. Elena Lazaro from the European Parliament's Research Service. Thank you very much, all of you, for your insights. I work in foreign policy as well, and we all share many of the same concerns. I wanted to link this panel to some of the things that were said in the previous one. Vice President Šefčovič talked a lot about the ways in which foresight can be integrated into legislation, regulation. The EU has been developing a number of tools in these areas. But the toolbox in foreign policy is a bit different. There's not that much legislation. Disruptions happen from one day to another. And foresight takes a different nature. A lot has been done by the EU. CSDP missions and operations were sent in Africa in countries that from one day to another toppled regimes, and we have different regimes there. Democracies turn into autocracies quite fast. So I wondered if the panel could reflect a bit on what is the nuanced difference between internal policies, external policies, given the competences that the EU has, and how foresight should address the specific tools that we have in foreign policy. Obviously, there's trade, there's financing, and there's diplomacy. But it would be great to reflect and hear a bit more about the link between foresight and our global engagement, particularly since this is ESPAS. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have a question about China and transatlantic relationship, question about Russia and hard power, and a question which is kind of, part of it is methodological and another part of it is really about the foreign policy toolbox. So I think you can all answer all questions, so why don't I propose that you pick and choose, and I'll start with Constanza. We'll keep the same order.
Okay, thanks. Those are all great questions. And complicated questions as well. Heather, I was curious when you said double whammy. I mean, I could think of another double whammy, right? Which is that the hard right wins in America and the hard right wins in the European elections and in European national elections, and that would be truly a double whammy, right? A multiple whammy, yeah, exactly. You know, I think my German response to that would be das eine tun und das andere nicht lassen. In other words, we do not have the choice of making choices, right? I think we have to deter Russia, right? And contain Russia and do something very similar with China, but in different ways, right? Because our relationship with China is so different. I want to emphasize one thing here. We shouldn't jump to conclusions about the American elections. I believe the strength of America, of democracy and democratic forces is great, and we saw that in the state elections last week, right, where there was a massive mobilization by the center-left because of abortion laws, even in very red states. But what I want to point to is just how thin the margins of those victories were, and that political fragmentation, both in America and in Europe, will lead to a thinning of the margins. So what we are looking at will be very harsh, extremely polarized fights about very narrow margins, and that changes the nature of our politics. That's something we need to pay attention to. My second point would be to say, we as policy mavens no longer have the luxury of ignoring the politics of the policy. We need to factor that in all the time. Right? And finally, I want to say on EU and NATO, I mean, I am all for the European Union taking a long, hard look at its hard power. But NATO is irreplaceable. And all of us Europeans know that. And why is that? Because we have a over 70-year-old practice of elaborating doctrine, fourth generation processes, and forced deployment processes together that the EU has never done, has never considered, would not know how to think about, and in case it did, remember, there's always one or two countries who would deploy a veto. That exists in NATO as well, but let's not kid ourselves. If we wanted to, if we thought the Americans were going to retreat from this, if we thought the Americans were going to have to leave NATO, I think we would have to, our position would have to be Europeanize NATO and leave a guest room for the Americans.
Thank you. If I may just add a comment, I agree with you that I think the United States is extraordinarily capable of renewal, but it hasn't happened. But this means that 2024 is not a foregone conclusion.
But the Biden administration, the most EU-friendly administration I have ever seen.
Exactly. But I think what's lacking in Europe is a real honest discussion about what might happen, but also in the eventuality of that happening, it's not just about strategic autonomy, it's also about how a second Trump administration would enable like-minded forces in Europe. And I don't see that debate taking place. Mikko.
A quick point on maybe, and Constanze, you know this much better, but the German debate about this possible Trump shock or GOP shock that we might see. I'm really worried that maybe the state of discussion in Berlin is representative of discussions elsewhere in Europe. And my understanding of it is we cannot really prepare for such a scenario because we need to wait for the political costs to be so high that we actually...
The shock will force us to
act. The shock will force us to act. And I find this deeply, I mean, the first panel had exactly this point. Foresight is there, but action is missing. So we have to be able to internalize the costs of greater resilience in preparation. I think that's a huge challenge, and we're not well prepared at this point. Quickly on two other points. I think we as Europeans are failing if we don't have a game plan that is somewhat agreed, discussed somewhere for a blockade scenario around Taiwan in the next 5 years, even earlier. And the blockade, is just ships being not able to enter the maritime space for more than 72 hours, go for a week. That's a very realistic scenario. And my understanding is we don't have a clue whatsoever what we're going to do in such a scenario. So let's not wait for the big landing invasion or Chinese rocket forces attacking Taiwan. Yes, we also have to discuss that. But a game plan for a very concrete, relatively likely implausible scenario, I think, needs to be developed. And final point on the methodology question in a way, I think we have a huge opportunity at this point for policy learning in the G7, but also wider groupings of countries on economic security. Other countries have much deeper exposure to China in trade and technology and investment than we have, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia. And they have taken steps to do economic security. We don't even know how to organize economic security in Europe. It's not our paradigm. Again, when you ask higher people in the German government, the response is, we don't know how to do that. And that means breaking up silos. It means sharing information. It's a complete new set about organizing, I think, assessments of strategic vulnerabilities. And it's great that central banks, for instance, are now moving ahead and providing data, but this needs to be also a parliamentary-driven process because I think it sits at the heart of our democracies moving forward.
Thank you. And before I turn to Stephen, let me just say that we do have a few moments, thanks to our panelists who are tackling very complex issues in a very direct way. We do have time for a few more questions and comments. So start preparing them. Great. And so I'll pass the floor to Stephen, and then I'll turn to these three gentlemen. Please.
Absolutely. I think that, as my co-panelists have indicated, there are plenty of reasons for Europeans to prepare for ever greater US-China strategic competition, actually regardless of the outcome of the 24 elections. I would like to make a plea for Europeans to think more robustly about these issues, but also keep a space to do this on EU terms. We have to be able to have a conversation about what is the right strategic positioning and what is the right policy response, and do so on European terms, not import terms of debate framed elsewhere. That's my first comment. On the Russia question, thank you for it. I think it's important to, acknowledge that for reasonable time frame policy purposes, we have to organize our security on the European continent with Russian containment being the basic premise. I think that would continue until 2040 beyond Putin personal fate. That's my read of the situation. And the real challenge is increasingly the alignment or not between Russia and China. Do you believe that there is a deep axis, a deep alliance between Russia and China for the foreseeable future, or do you see other scenarios? And I think that's something that, in my read of the situation, is that those two are increasingly acting as a real pair. And it's, you see this in various multilateral places, you see this around the world, and that will be my policy assumption. And we can then discuss what that means for policy choices. And finally, on Elena's question on foresight and its linked to policy and choices, look, my big plea will be, there's a premium on knowing better and analyzing the world, and that's what ESPAS is all about, and that's what parliamentary research services and EU institutes for security studies are all about. It's also critically important that we have more flexibility in the season. This is really my experience over the last 20 years. We are a bit this oil tanker as EU, and it's very difficult to shift paradigms or to take rapid decisions on pretty much anything, really, to reallocate financial and other resources, to deploy forces when you need to. And so overall, a greater degree of flexibility to be injected in the system will be very popular with me. Thanks.
Yeah, it might be helpful if this panel travelled, did a roadshow in the capitals of Europe so that member states realised what's at stake. Right, we have 3 questions in this part of the room, so I'll ask you to introduce yourselves. Can you put your hand up so we can get one? And then there was another one in the front row, and a third.
Adrian Taylor, foresight practitioner, former EU Commission official in external relations. What I hear is a regret that indeed the system of prosperity for us seems to be going out of the window. The system that brought us peace for us is going out the window. What strikes me is that for a lot of the world, that was not the case. They did not see the system that we have in place until now as being the prosperity mechanism or the peace mechanism. And that makes me wonder, what is it we can offer, thinking in the future, which will be the offer of a new, different world which we can attract people to? You've mentioned it. Why do the Asians not follow us on these things? Well, there are lots of good reasons why the system is not working for them. Start with basically an international institutional setup that was set up by after a world war 80 years ago in which they had no role. So let's start thinking, what are the positive points we can push forward where we can build the new instruction, which is not going to be the old one, it's going to be a new one, but where we can engage with them. That would be my comment and question.
Thank you. Okay, and then we'll come to this. Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much for this extremely stimulating debate. I'm Laurent Bonneau. I'm a strategy consultant. When I think about the future, I think about our children and grandchildren very strongly. And there is a word I think I haven't heard so far, which is education. And I think this is key to many of the challenges we have today, and especially internal political challenges. I noticed in the last 20 to 30 years, since I'm also an academic, the fading up of many disciplines in our schools programs, like history, philosophy, sometimes even literature, which leads to the fact that our children and sometimes grandchildren are much more accessible to fake news and all sorts of manipulations. What can the EU do to reinforce this knowledge, which may be seen as a soft component, but is very important, which means our history, philosophical ideas, debate, and reinforce this, especially for the young generations.
Thank you very much. And there's one more question here at the front from... Thank you.
I will be really telegraphic. I'm Maurizio Sarri from the European Commission. As you have said, here we talk about strategic choices for the future. And the time frame is to 2040 perspective. But we spoke about Russia, we spoke about China, we spoke about the US, and we didn't mention a lot of regions of the world that may have an importance in the future. I refer to the Global South, I refer to the BRICS, and this establishment of new alliances that may have importance in the long term also for raw materials and sustainability. How do you think these elements should also be incorporated in a long-term perspective at the global level in geopolitical terms?
Thank you very much. So we have two questions really about the rest of the world and one question about our own future education and next generations. I'll ask you to be brief, no more than 2 minutes each. Stephen, do you want to start?
Let me start this time.
Yeah.
And perhaps I can take question 1 and 3 together, because I think they sort of go in the same direction of how do we relate to a more plural world. I think it's absolutely right to also recall that for many people, the deal that we see indeed is not seen as attractive as they see. So I think it's a question that gets you into the territory of what price are we willing to pay in order to build the alliances that we need for the future. And the price can be measured in different respects. It can be measured indeed at seats at top tables. It can be measured in voting weights at international organizations. It also can be measured in policy accommodation that we may need to accept. There are trade-offs here. And it does get you back to the point I tried to make at the very beginning. The offer that the European Union is able to make to our partners in Africa, across the Indo-Pacific, Latin America, and elsewhere, will need to be substantially upgraded. It will need to be a better offer than we are able to mobilize right now. So that will be my answer on that. On FEMI and education, it's a whole area, but I think actually the European Union can also sometimes take credit for getting things right. And in this space, I would say that we have come relatively early with the diagnosis of the real threat that FEMI poses and foreign interference poses. And there's actually quite a broad toolbox that on the foreign policy side is available. What we now need to do is mobilize this and roll this out with partners in the Balkans, across Africa, but also, of course, at home, which I think is what you were referring to. But I think later on in the day, people will go in more detail on that issue. Thanks.
Miko?
Briefly on the premises of your question of our success not necessarily being everyone's success. At least in the case of China, I think we can say that China has benefited tremendously from the type of order that has been built and the interactions and global economic rules and stability, etc. So I think it's a mixed picture of who has benefited. China clearly is in the camp of the winners of globalization in the way it has been shaped. But you're absolutely right. I think we are in the business of not just defending a liberal international rules-based order, but rather in a process of reconstructing it and making space for other actors in international financial institutions is an old agenda, but it needs to happen, and it needs to happen fast. We also need to make sure that we allow for policy space in trade agreements or in other arrangements where the development needs of other countries are more respected than they have been in the past. I think that's a lesson of the past 20 years. And then I think we have to be very proactive. China definitely is in the space of shaping new rules for arenas in which we don't have them. AI governance is one where the UK has been particularly active recently. The European Union has an ambition to be a regulation and standard setter. China definitely is in that space too. So, and we realize that rarely enough, but still, sometimes we seem to agree in certain principles with regard to AI, ethics, risks, etc. And we have to maximize those islands of agreement as much as possible, because I think we're deeply in need of that.
Costanza, you have the final word.
All right. Well, first, all of that.
Plus.
Exactly. Yes, have we been guilty of double standards vis-a-vis the rest of the world? I don't really like the term Global South. Yes, we have. Guilty as charged. Could we do better? Absolutely. But I would also say that we are within our rights to point out that the Russians and the Chinese in the world tend to support authoritarian regimes, and that comes at a cost to populations, and that the EU is a much gentler, kinder lender or grantor than, say, the Chinese government is, right? And I think that we should have the confidence to say that, right? In other words, pushing back on some of those narratives and pushing back on disinformation, which comes to your education point, is something the EU ought to do much more proactively. I do want to sort of pick up Bart Shevchik's point on Russia one last time, because I think that is sort of very much in the now, even if I'm accused of being presentist. The Russians are, of course, using hybrid methods, right, to probe and prod at our own domestic vulnerabilities every day. Can we do more about that? Absolutely, not least by combating disinformation. The Russians are circumventing our economic sanctions every day and all the time, including with the help of the Chinese. Are we doing enough against that? No, we can do more there. I think, if I'm Stephen, I might sort of put a sharper twist on your formulation, which is to say that we will have to plan for a European security order, construct a European security order against Russia for as long as Russia is internally totalitarian and externally imperial. And that means, for example, since you and I were mentioning what the German debate, that means examining or asking for convincing proof of all those who now are arguing for negotiations, right? What proof do you have that Russia is currently willing or able to engage in negotiations on any other terms than those that they permanently state, which is the complete eradication of Ukrainian sovereignty? It would be a security threat to Europe if we succumb to that. And finally, I just want to point out, I thought a very compelling articulation of the threat that America is currently facing in a piece by former Secretary of Defense Bill Gates in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, who said America is now looking at increasingly an alignment, if not an alliance, of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Iran and North Korea, as you know, are supplying weapons to Russia, and apparently a limited amount. And that the four of them together will have double the amount of nuclear weapons that America has. Now, that's a pretty compelling way of stating the threat. Now imagine an America that is no longer on Europe's side. That's what we are facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constanza. This has been a formidable panel. Thank you so much. I think we head to a coffee break, is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
So thank you. But can I just ask everyone to join me in thanking the panel?
Yes. Thank you from my side as well. And before I release you to the coffee break, so you can already go and you can be the first at the coffee, I would like to release you. We have a 30 minutes break, but before this, you have on your badges a little QR code with which leads you to a Slido question. And I suggest that you take that with you for the coffee break. The question is, which global trend will have the biggest impact on the future of the EU by 2040? So if you reply to this, we'll pick this up after the coffee break. Have a look to Christoph, what he is doing. We'll meet back at 11:30 sharp for the session on globalization and deglobalization, the future of economic power. Thank you.